L.com.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
That marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug.
Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room.
I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it and didn't inhale.
And one major responsibility is to encourage people to use less drugs.
Entirely legitimate topic for debate.
Radical Rant.
Welcome back, everyone. 50 after the hour. Today in the rant, I want to talk a little bit about the myth of the stoned driver. This is something that is used by our opponents who really have only two arguments left against marijuana legalization. That is, what about the children and stoned mayhem on the freeways? And this latest study to come out from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is like a stake through the heart of this zombie lie. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration on Friday said, quote, the first large-scale crash risk study in the United States to include drugs other than alcohol found that once the data were adjusted for confounding variables, cannabis consumption was not associated with an increased probability of getting into an accident. Let us underscore that. Using cannabis does not lead to an increased risk of getting into an accident. We have heard Kevin Sabet and the drug warriors for years now telling us that using cannabis, even a little bit of cannabis, leads to double the risk of getting into a car crash. But this study, this included more than 3,000 drivers who got into crashes during a 20-month period in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and compared them to 6,000 controls driving in the same area in the same period who didn't get into accidents. Now, as usual, they found that alcohol was highly predictive of a crash risk. They found that blood alcohol content of 0.08 led to twice the crash risk. Not marijuana use. Being at the legal limit for alcohol, twice the crash risk. For drivers at 0.10, 6 times the crash risk. For drivers at 0.15, 12 times the crash risk. But when it came to drivers that tested positive for active THC, we're not talking about metabolites here, active THC, they were 25% more likely to be involved in crashes. Not twice the risk, just 25% more. But once the researchers took into account sex, age, and race, the risk ratio shrank from 25% more likely to 5% more likely, which is within the margin of error, no longer statistically significant. Also, they found that the primary reason we are seeing that increased risk among people who have cannabis in their system is because people with cannabis in their system have an increased chance of being young, male, and people that drink alcohol. That was what was leading to these previous studies showing that increased risk. They said further adjusting for alcohol consumption made the crash risk of cannabis consumers equal to that of drivers who tested negative for alcohol and all other drugs. No evidence that marijuana use increases crash risk. Now, there's no doubt in a lot of these studies that marijuana does lead to impairing effects. They've shown that. They've shown reaction time problems, space-time, lateral positioning, all these kind of problems that they find in simulations and studies. But that does not correlate to what's happening in the real world. It's kind of like that little fact nugget they throw out at you every now and then. They say, well, marijuana's got 400 chemicals in it. It's got all these carcinogens in it. Marijuana is just chock full of carcinogens. But what they fail to point out is that cancer wards are not chock full of marijuana users. We talked about these studies earlier that show lower risk of cancer among people that use cannabis. So yes, cannabis smoke has carcinogens in it, but that does not mean that cannabis smoke is carcinogenic. Just like water has hydrogen and oxygen in it. Hydrogen is extremely flammable and explosive, but water will not light, no matter how much you try, unless, it's some of that South Dakota fracking land water, but whatever. Chemistry matters. The makeup of these compounds matters. Just like the fact that marijuana may cause some temporary small amounts of impairment does not necessarily mean the people who are impaired therefore get into more crashes. Because like we see with THC being a substance that helps to reduce cancer, we see that marijuana use tends to reduce people's courage. It's the opposite of alcohol. People on alcohol are too messed up to drive, but believe they aren't. People on marijuana are okay to drive, but think they aren't. It's kind of the opposite. People will refuse to drive when they feel they are too high. We have seen this in the simulator studies and the test track studies, where they get people high, in a repeated, take a bowl every 20 minutes or so. And after like the third bowl, a lot of these test subjects say, I really, in the real world, I wouldn't get behind the wheel right now. I wouldn't do this right now. You rarely, if ever, hear that from people that are drinking alcohol, because alcohol lowers one's judgment and one's perception of one's own impairment. Marijuana does not lower one's judgment, nor does it lower one's perception of impairment. In fact, it exacerbates it. There's a bit of a paranoia that makes you think you're more impaired than you really are. But to me, folks, the proof is in the pudding on this one. It's not as if legalization has introduced marijuana and cars. Marijuana has existed in popular culture for 4 decades now. 5 decades, if you want to. Let's go 5 decades, right? We can go back to the mid 60s. People have been using marijuana. Lots of young people have been using marijuana. And yet nobody has associated that with any sort of fear of a stoned driver in the real world. You can kind of tell a little bit about a culture by the stereotypes and jokes that it comes up with. Usually there's like some kernel of truth in there that led to that stereotype or to that joke. And of course, the standard joke or stereotype of marijuana drivers is the drunk driver runs through the stop sign. The stoned driver sits there and waits for it to turn green. Now, it's a silly joke, but it does reiterate it wouldn't be funny if there wasn't a kernel of truth to it. People wouldn't find that funny. Drunk driving is not thought of as funny anymore. Now, I grew up in a time in the 70s, my dad got 4 or 5 DUIs, rolled a couple of cars, never wrecked into anyone. It was all by himself, usually falling asleep at the wheel. But that was just considered something that happened. It was just, something that we as a society put up with. That, we have a right to drink and people can get drunk and every now and then they drive their cars home and wreck. That was just every day. That was no big deal. But our culture changed and began to realize the extreme danger from intoxicated drivers. Now, it's not as if during the whole era of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which really took off in the 1980s, it wasn't as if people weren't also aware of marijuana and didn't realize lots of people were using it. By 1979, we experienced the peak of American marijuana use in monthly consumption terms. 60% of high school seniors had tried marijuana. And yet, we didn't also see a Mothers Against Stoned Driving taking off. That wasn't considered to be a big risk, a big problem. The alcohol risk was so clear and convincing that Mothers Against Drunk Driving took off like a shot and managed to lobby successfully to get 0.08 as the blood alcohol standard, lobbied successfully to get age 21 as the universal drinking age in the United States. Why was there not also a severe drive against stoned driving at that time? Because they didn't perceive it to be a problem. Because it's not a problem. And now the data are in. The United States government has proclaimed it. And you got to imagine that the drug warriors who've relied for so long on stoned mayhem on the freeways are spinning desperately to try to find a way to make this sound scary to people. Well, folks, that's all the time we got for Hour 1. Thanks for joining us today. Stay tuned for Hour 2, Toker Talk Radio. We'll take your calls at 971-533-7111. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about that shifting paradigm and addiction that I had mentioned, how Johan Hari and a lot of progressive researchers are getting rid of that stupid disease model of addiction and looking at it a different way. Plus, I will deliver my presentation on how not to piss off your cannabis clientele. For everyone here at 420 Radio, I'm Radical Russ. Until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant